What would you do if a starving dog with ribs showing through its skin sat outside a military hospital for days in dust, heat, rain, and darkness, refusing food, refusing sleep, and refusing to leave until one wounded soldier finally walked back out through the emergency doors? The people who passed that entrance every day had their own answers. Some thought the animal was sick. Some thought it was dangerous. Some thought it was simply too broken to understand that the man it waited for might already be dead. But the dog did not move. It stayed beside the cracked concrete steps beneath the emergency ward sign with the kind of silent certainty that made even hardened men look twice. Its coat was once strong and black and tan, but now it hung in rough, dirty patches over a body thinned by hunger and weather. One ear carried an old tear. One front leg favored the ground slightly when it shifted. And yet its eyes never lost their focus, because every time the hospital doors hissed open, that skeletal stray rose to its feet and searched the faces coming out as if the whole world depended on one of them. If you believe in stories where loyalty survives war, pain, and the cruelty of silence, then this journey on Shepherd Soldier Stories is for you. No one standing at that hospital entrance understood that the dog was not waiting out of habit. It was waiting because weeks earlier, in a desert where the wind carried smoke and blood instead of rain, one wounded infantryman had done something no one else had done for it. He had looked at it like it was still alive. The hospital stood at the edge of a military district where dust from the outer roads always seemed to cling to the glass, the walls, the boots of the guards, and the tired faces of families who came carrying fear in quiet little ways. It was the kind of place where men arrived whole and left changed, or arrived changed and hoped to leave breathing. Ambulances came and went under floodlights. Orderlies pushed gurneys through the entrance at all hours. Nurses carrying paper cups of stale coffee crossed the courtyard before sunrise with shadows under their eyes. Security men at the gate checked vehicles and waved through medical transports with a rhythm so practiced it no longer looked human. Yet even in a place built around pain, the stray dog became impossible to ignore. It sat near the emergency doors through everything. Through the baking afternoons when heat shimmered above the pavement. Through the nights when cold slipped down from the higher roads and settled into the concrete. Through one ugly storm that turned the hospital yard into mud and forced most of the waiting families under the awning, while the dog remained outside in the rain, soaked to the bone and still facing the doors. Staff began talking about it in whispers between shifts. A trauma nurse with tired hands started bringing scraps of chicken and rice in a paper bowl. A cleaner left a shallow pan of water near the wall. A security guard in his 50s, a man who usually disliked stray animals around the entrance, broke a piece from his own breakfast bread and tossed it toward the dog one dawn. But the animal accepted almost nothing. It drank only enough water to stay upright, and ate only when weakness finally made the body louder than the waiting. Even then it never took food from a hand before glancing back at the entrance, as if afraid that in the 1 second it looked away, the man it needed might appear and vanish again. The first person to really notice the meaning inside that vigil was not a doctor, a soldier, or an officer. It was an old woman who sat near the outpatient garden most mornings selling tea from a steel kettle balanced over a small charcoal burner. She had watched that hospital long enough to understand grief when it appeared without asking permission. She saw how the dog rose every time a stretcher came in from the combat wing. She saw how it limped toward ambulances and sniffed at the wheels and lower doors with growing agitation, not searching for food, but for a scent. She saw how one evening, when a nurse tried to coax it farther away from the entrance for its own safety, the dog resisted with such desperate force that it collapsed onto the concrete and dragged itself back toward the doors with its front paws. Not aggression. Not stupidity. Panic. The old woman had buried a son years earlier and recognized devotion when it stopped looking reasonable to other people. "It is waiting for someone from the battlefield," she said to the guards in a low voice that sounded more like a truth remembered than a guess. The younger guard laughed at first. The older one did not, because by then, he too had started noticing the pattern. The dog did not react the same way to everyone coming through the hospital. It ignored visitors. It ignored civilian staff. It ignored the sound of meal carts and maintenance trucks and normal movement. But whenever men in desert-stained uniforms came in on stretchers or limped out of ambulances with fresh bandages and ash still trapped in the seams of their boots, the dog became a wire pulled tight. It searched them all. Every face. Every hand. Every piece of cloth carrying the smell of conflict. 3 nights after the dog first appeared, a convoy came in just before dawn. The emergency yard was still gray with half-light when the outer gate opened and 2 military ambulances rolled through, followed by a transport truck and a jeep carrying armed escorts. The atmosphere changed instantly, the way it always did when fresh casualties arrive from a live operation. Orderlies broke into a run. Emergency lights flashed across the hospital wall in sharp red pulses. Voices rose. Wheels rattled over uneven concrete. One of the ambulances had blood on the inside of the rear door before it even opened. The stray dog, which had been lying so still near the entrance that some people thought it had finally slept, was on its feet before the first medic stepped down. It limped forward in a straight line toward the second ambulance with such certainty that the security men moved to block it. The dog dodged one, slid on its weak front leg, regained balance, and reached the rear wheel just as the doors swung open. It did not bark. It did not growl. It lifted its head into the smell spilling out from inside, and froze, so completely it looked carved from the same exhausted grief as the men unloading the wounded. There, beneath the sharp odors of antiseptic, blood, fuel, burned fabric, and battlefield dust, the animal found what it had come for. A scent carried in from the desert. One soldier among many. One man whose body was being transferred on a stretcher with tubes at his side, a heavy bandage wrapped across his chest and shoulder, and a face so pale beneath dried grime that he already looked halfway absent from the world. The dog tried to surge toward him, but a medic shoved it back with a curse, and the stretcher vanished through the emergency doors in a flood of motion. The dog hit the concrete, scrambled up, and this time barked once. It was not a wild sound. It was short, cracked, and painfully human in the way desperate hope sometimes sounded. No one outside that entrance knew what had happened in the desert 2 weeks earlier. No one there knew that the infantryman on that stretcher had been part of a battered unit cut off during a chaotic skirmish near a ruined supply route where half-buried vehicles, collapsed walls, and drifting smoke had turned the entire landscape into a maze of bad angles and blind death. The fighting had been short by military standards and endless by human ones. The kind of engagement where men lost track of time because survival narrowed life to breath, dust, and the next 10 feet. The infantryman had gone down near the edge of a collapsed market structure after taking shrapnel through the upper torso and another deep cut along the side. He had remained conscious long enough to keep firing until his magazine ran dry and long enough after that to crawl behind broken stone while the rest of the unit fought to reform a line. It was there, in the thick metallic smell of blood and hot concrete, that he first saw the dog. At the time it barely looked like a dog at all. More like a starving ghost moving through smoke. It slipped between broken stalls and cratered walls with the caution of something used to being kicked away from everything alive. The coat was filthy, the ribs visible, the muzzle scarred, one ear torn, and the eyes too old for an animal that young. It should have run from gunfire. Instead it kept circling back toward the wounded man, because he had dropped part of a ration pouch when he fell. He remembered that later only in fragments, because pain and blood loss had already begun tearing the moment apart. But some details remained sharp. the dog creeping forward one step at a time while shots cracked overhead. The way its whole body flinched at every sound, and yet still returned. The way it paused when he pushed the ration toward it with shaking fingers instead of trying to scare it off. And most of all, the look in its face when it realized the food was meant for it. That was the first bond. Not grand. Not cinematic. Just a starving animal and a wounded soldier in the same broken place, both too close to death to waste energy pretending they didn't recognize each other. He fed it half the ration, and would have fed it the rest if another burst of fire had not struck the wall above him and driven both of them flatter against the ground. The dog should have fled then. Most sane creatures would have. But when the infantryman later tried to crawl toward a better position and nearly blacked out from blood loss, the animal did something stranger. It ran several yards ahead, stopped, turned, and barked once. Not a threat. A direction. Then it ran again toward a gap between two collapsed walls the soldier had not noticed through smoke and shock. He followed because there was nothing else to follow. The gap led into a narrow service alley protected from the worst fire lanes. From there, he made it behind a burned transport shell where two of his men eventually reached him. By the time they dragged him to the extraction point, the dog had vanished. Or so he thought. The next time he saw it, he was on the field evac line drifting in and out of consciousness under canvas and dust and rotor wash. And the same stray was there again under the edge of the loading zone barrier, dodging boots and noise just to keep eyes on the one man who had fed it. One medic had laughed and said the damn thing thought it was enlisted. Another had tried to kick it back. The infantryman had managed one hoarse sentence before darkness took him under. "Don't hurt it!" That sentence traveled farther than he knew. Because men under pressure remembered strange things. They remembered jokes. They remembered curses. They remembered final requests, even the small ones. By the time the wounded infantryman reached the hospital and disappeared into surgery, 3 different soldiers from that unit had already told the story in pieces, about the skeletal stray that wouldn't leave the perimeter, about how it had somehow led their wounded man through rubble, about how it followed the evacuation line like it belonged to him. Stories moved through military spaces the way heat moved through old pipes, unevenly, invisibly, and then suddenly everywhere. By the second day at the hospital, an orderly knew about the dog. By the third, 2 nurses from the surgical wing knew. By the fourth, even the doctor overseeing the infantryman's recovery had heard that there was a stray outside the emergency entrance acting like a family member denied visiting hours. The soldier inside the hospital knew none of this. He lay in a room that smelled of antiseptic, stale air conditioning, cotton dressings, and the faint medicinal bitterness of the drugs keeping his pain one step behind him. Tubes ran from his arm. Bandages bound his chest and side. His breathing remained shallow because anything deeper reminded the body of damage it was trying very hard not to think about. Most days, he drifted between sleep and memory without any clean border between the two. Sometimes he woke convinced he was still under the collapsed wall with dust in his teeth and blood inside his boot. Sometimes he woke hearing the monitor first and remembering the war second. The men from his unit came when they could. One sat beside the bed one night and talked in a low voice about useless normal things, motorbikes, card games, the awful coffee from the field kitchen, because useless normal things were sometimes kinder than asking a wounded man how he felt. Another came with his forearm in a cast and said the dog was still outside. The infantryman had thought he was delirious when he heard that. He turned his head too fast, pain tore through his ribs, and all he managed was one ragged question. "The same one?" His comrade nodded. "Still there." The wounded soldier stared at the ceiling for a long time after that, and for the first time since surgery something in his face changed. Not peace. Not relief. Something smaller and more dangerous. A reason. Outside the hospital entrance, the stray dog rose again as the emergency doors opened, searching the faces of the men stepping out into the pale morning light, still refusing to leave, still carrying in its gaunt body a loyalty no one there had yet fully understood. And before the week was over, that loyalty would force the entire hospital to witness the truth of what had been born under fire. What if the only creature waiting for you outside the hospital was the one witness left who understood exactly what you had been through, even when you could barely understand it yourself? The wounded infantryman kept returning to that thought in the long empty hours between pain medication, dressing changes, and the dim half-sleep where memory bled into fever. The hospital moved around him with practiced efficiency, but his own body felt foreign, heavy, and unreliable, as if war had not just injured him, but partially repossessed him from the inside. Breathing hurt. Turning hurt. Silence sometimes hurt more than both, because silence gave the mind room to return to the desert skirmish in pieces too sharp to ignore. He remembered the sound of rounds clipping stone. He remembered the sudden hot punch in his torso, and the cold realization that followed it. He remembered trying to stay awake not out of courage, but because he knew unconsciousness in a place like that usually belonged to the dead or nearly dead. And in the middle of those violent fragments, one image kept surviving with unnatural clarity. The stray dog standing in the smoke and dust, skeletal but steady, watching him with an intensity that felt less like fear and more like recognition. It was a ridiculous thing to hold onto in a trauma ward full of burned men, broken men, and men stitched together by skill and stubbornness. Yet it held. Because the war had taken a great deal from him before that day: sleep, trust, part of his hearing in one ear, the easy version of his future, and the certainty that courage always looked noble from the inside. The dog had given him something very small and very dangerous in return. A reason to believe he had not been entirely abandoned on that ground. By the sixth day, he was no longer under the deepest sedation, which meant the dreams got worse. They lost their soft edges. He would wake before dawn with his pulse spiking and his right hand clenched around the bed sheet so hard the nurse had to peel his fingers away one by one. He almost never shouted. That was not his way. The fear lived lower and quieter than that. In the way his breath broke when a tray hit metal too sharply. In the way his eyes snapped toward the door whenever wheels rattled fast along the hallway. In the way he sometimes stared at the window like he could still see the desert through the glass instead of the military courtyard and the outer wall beyond it. The nurses learned him slowly. The younger ones first thought he was simply stoic. The older ones recognized the more troubling truth. Some men came back from battle carrying noise inside them that never fully left, and those men often looked the calmest just before they cracked. One night, while checking the drainage tube and fresh bandage seals, a trauma nurse in her 40s spoke to him in the same tone mothers and medics both used when they knew they were about to say something simple that mattered more than all the complicated things around it. "The dog is still outside." He turned his head toward her carefully, slower now, because he had learned pain punished speed. "Why?" The nurse adjusted the blanket near his arm and gave the smallest tired smile. "I thought you'd tell me." He closed his eyes after that, not because he was done with the conversation, but because he had no answer that didn't sound absurd. Why did anything stay after violence was finished? Men didn't. Units didn't. Promises often didn't. Yet a starving stray with a torn ear and old scars had remained at the emergency entrance as if hospital walls, guards, weather, and time were all irrelevant next to one wounded soldier going in and not yet coming out. Outside, the dog's vigil was beginning to alter the behavior of everyone around the entrance, whether they admitted it or not. The older security guard, who had once wanted the animal chased off, now started leaving one section of the perimeter open when his shift began, pretending not to notice if the stray slept near the far pillar as long as it did not lunge at patients or block stretchers. A nurse from the night shift, exhausted and practical by nature, began sneaking scraps of boiled chicken from the kitchen and setting them 2 meters from the entrance each dawn. Sometimes the dog ignored them until hours later. Sometimes it ate half and left the rest. It never fully relaxed while doing so. Even with its muzzle in the bowl, its eyes kept moving to the doors. Visitors started recognizing it. A boy waiting for his father's test results called it the hospital soldier dog. An old man with a cane told anyone who would listen that animals knew more about loyalty than people did. The tea seller in the courtyard began placing a metal water basin beneath the bench nearest the wall, where the animal sometimes sheltered from sun, but never from view of the entrance. Even the administration noticed. One afternoon, a junior officer from facilities arrived with a complaint about hygiene and stray management, only to find 2 nurses, 1 medic, and the older security guard standing in subtle opposition to the idea of removing the dog. No one said it plainly, but they had all become witnesses to something they no longer wanted broken. The officer left muttering about regulations. The dog remained. It remained through heat, through noise, through one afternoon when 2 ambulances arrived together, and the entire courtyard turned to motion and shouting and stretcher wheels. It remained after a child visiting a relative tried to pet it, and the animal gently stepped back without aggression, eyes never leaving the emergency ward entrance. It remained through a night of hard rain that left its coat plastered to its bones, and the concrete around the steps shining under yellow lamps like polished stone. People could not explain it any more by hunger or confusion. Hunger wandered. Confusion broke. This looked like intention. The wounded infantryman's condition improved in the narrow medical sense first. Fever lowered. Internal bleeding stabilized. The wound across his side stopped threatening infection. He was allowed to sit upright for short periods with assistance, though each attempt left his face gray and his shirt damp with effort beneath the gown. The body was healing because bodies often obeyed medicine even when the rest of a person had not decided whether healing was deserved. But emotional recovery moved like something buried under debris. One afternoon, when an officer from his battalion came with paperwork and careful condolences disguised as updates, the conversation drifted toward the skirmish. It should not have. The officer knew better. Yet grief in military spaces often wore bureaucratic clothing, and before either man could stop it, names were being said softly into the room. 2 dead. 1 transferred in critical condition north. Another losing a leg. A supply route compromised because intelligence was old before it arrived. The infantryman listened with his jaw clenched so hard that the muscles near his ear jumped visibly. He did not cry. Again, that was not his way. He only turned his face toward the window and stopped answering until the officer, embarrassed by his own mistake, gathered the papers and left. When the door shut, the room became too small. The ceiling too low. The air too thin. For a dangerous minute, the hospital bed felt more like a trap than a place of recovery. The monitor clipped to his finger began warning before he fully realized his heart had accelerated. A nurse came in, took one look at him, and said nothing about breathing techniques or panic or resilience. She only walked to the window, moved the curtain wider, and said quietly, "He's there." The infantryman followed her gaze. Down in the courtyard, near the emergency entrance steps, the dog sat in its usual place, thin and ragged and absolutely fixed on the door. It had no reason to know he was looking from that room at that exact moment. Yet seeing it there changed something immediate and physical inside him. Not cured. Not erased. But interrupted. The spiral did not vanish. It loosened just enough for him to breathe again. That evening he asked for details. Not about the dead. Not about the operation. About the dog. The younger medic cleaning his dressing looked surprised by the question, then oddly relieved to answer something that did not involve blood counts, pain scale numbers, or infection markers. "It's been there almost the whole time since you came in," he said. "Refuses to leave the entrance for long. Barely eats. Tried to get into triage twice." Security pushed it back, but it always comes right here again. The infantryman stared at the far wall as the medic worked. "It follows everyone. No barks? Only when a new ambulance comes from your sector, or when they move combat casualties fast." The soldier's throat tightened. "Anybody hit it?" The medic hesitated, then shook his head. "Not now." That answer mattered more than the rest. It told him the hospital had, in its awkward institutional way, begun to accept the animal as part of the story of his recovery. He let that knowledge settle. Then, in a voice almost too low to hear, he asked the question that had really been waiting behind the others. "How bad does it look?" The medic glanced toward the window, then back at the man on the bed. "Bad enough that if it didn't have a reason, it wouldn't still be standing." After that, the infantryman began asking to sit up near the window each afternoon. The staff pretended not to notice how often his gaze drifted downward to the entrance. He never called for binoculars or a closer bed placement or anything that would make the watching obvious. He only asked to remain upright a little longer than the body wanted, one hand braced at his side against the pull of healing flesh, while his eyes searched the courtyard below. The first time he clearly saw the dog from above in full daylight, the shock of its condition hit him harder than the memory had. In the desert the animal had been skeletal, yes, but movement and smoke had disguised the severity. Here, under the clean, cruel honesty of afternoon sun, every rib was visible. The torn ear looked older and meaner. One hindquarter carried an old scar where fur had never grown back evenly. The dog rose every time the emergency doors moved and sat down again only when each face had been checked and dismissed. It never howled, never paced aimlessly, never wandered farther than the edge of visual control. Devotion had reduced its whole life to one repeating action: door face, no, wait again. The soldier found himself thinking back not only to the skirmish, but to the minutes before it. The unit had halted in a blown-out settlement where market roofs sagged under dust and heat, and tension had already settled over the patrol because the silence felt prepared. That was when he first noticed the stray far off between collapsed walls, watching from shade with the same hard, intelligent eyes. It had looked more ghost than dog then, too. One of the younger soldiers had tossed part of a biscuit, and the animal had vanished before the food landed. Another had laughed and said even the dogs knew this district belonged to the dead. Later, after the ambush, after the shrapnel, after the crawl through smoke, that same animal had returned and stayed. Why? Hunger began the bond. That much he understood. But hunger alone did not carry a stray from battlefield to evacuation line to hospital entrance. Something else had formed in the blast radius between them. Something beyond simple dependence. In the desert, when he pushed the ration toward the animal instead of taking the last of it himself, he had not been trying to save a dog. He had been trying to remain the kind of man who still noticed suffering smaller than his own. Maybe the animal recognized that. Maybe survival created its own language. Maybe loyalty, once sparked under fire, did not care whether it lived in a man or a creature the world called stray. The decision to go outside happened sooner than the doctors wanted and later than his pride could tolerate. On the 9th day, after one difficult physical therapy session left him shaking and angry at the weakness in his own legs, he told the attending surgeon that he wanted escorted courtyard time. The surgeon, who had operated on too many stubborn soldiers to be surprised by this, said no immediately. The infantryman said very little in response, which was always a bad sign. By evening a compromise emerged, because hospitals were full of professionals trained in anatomy, but also unavoidably influenced by stories. 10 minutes. Wheelchair. 2 medics nearby. No overexertion. No exposure if his blood pressure crashed. The nurse who rolled him toward the elevator that next morning kept her face neutral, but there was an unmistakable gentleness in the way she arranged the blanket over his lap. The descent felt longer than any battlefield extraction. When the elevator doors opened onto the ground floor, every sound sharpened, the echo of shoes on polished tile, distant announcements over old speakers, stretcher wheels, the hiss of the automatic entrance, the muffled traffic beyond the outer gate. By the time he reached the glass doors, his pulse had climbed for reasons having nothing to do with the wound under the bandages. One medic moved ahead to clear space. The older security guard at the entrance saw who was coming and, without being told why it mattered, stepped aside and looked toward the concrete steps. The dog was there. At first it did not understand what it was seeing. The wheelchair came through the doors surrounded by hospital smells, uniform fabric washed too clean, metal, medicine, and the thin change scent of a body cut open and stitched back together. The animal rose slowly, not running forward, not barking, just standing with its whole body pulled tight as if even hope had become dangerous after so many false door openings. The soldier felt his throat close. Up close the dog was even thinner than from the window. Mud had dried in cracks along the paws. One eye carried an old yellowing bruise. Fresh rain had recently flattened the coat, and in that weakened body he could still see the alert working shape the animal might once have had before the street and the war and the hunger stripped it down. For one long heartbeat they only looked at each other. Then the dog took 3 limping steps forward, stopped just beyond arm's reach, and made the smallest sound the soldier had heard from it yet. Not a bark. Not a whine. A broken exhale, like a held breath finally being released after too many days. The medics froze. The guard froze. The tea seller in the courtyard lowered her cup and stopped moving. Even the air seemed to wait. The soldier leaned forward in the wheelchair despite the pain, and said the first true thing his body had wanted to say since waking. "You stayed." And the dog, skeletal and scarred and loyal beyond all reason, took one final step and rested its head against the soldier's knee. What if the first thing that truly pulled a wounded soldier back toward life was not medicine, not orders, not even the voices of his own unit, but the quiet weight of a starving dog resting its head against his knee as if it had already decided that leaving was no longer an option for either of them? The hospital entrance seemed to hold its breath around that moment. The medic standing behind the wheelchair did not interrupt. The older security guard did not step in. The tea seller in the courtyard, who had seen grief where many faces across many years, lowered her eyes for a second the way people sometimes did in the presence of something too honest to stare at directly. The dog pressed its head there only once at first, just long enough to confirm the scent beneath the hospital soap, bandages, and blood-cleaning chemicals was the same scent it had followed from the battlefield to the ambulance, and from the ambulance to the emergency doors. Then it lifted its face and searched him again with those dry, intelligent eyes, as if checking that the body in the chair was not another trick played by walls, doors, and disappearing men. The infantryman looked back and felt something inside his chest shift in a way pain could not fully stop. It was not dramatic. No sudden healing. No miracle warm enough to erase the desert from his bones. The stitches still pulled under the bandage when he breathed too deep. The weakness in his legs still burned with humiliation. The dead were still dead. But the emptiness that had followed him out of surgery, and through those long white hospital nights loosened by one painful inch. He lifted his shaking hand, slow enough not to frighten the animal, and touched the top of the dog's head with the backs of his fingers. The coat was rough, dirty, thinner than it should have been, and warm with life. That warmth hit him harder than any memory had. Because under all the dust, all the scars, all the hospital noise, this animal was real. It had survived. It had come back. It had waited. The dog closed its eyes for 1 second under the touch and leaned harder into his knee, and in that tiny surrender there was more trust than the soldier believed he deserved. The 10 minutes the doctors had approved turned into 20 before anyone had the courage to end it. The nurse standing nearest finally cleared her throat and reminded him softly that he needed to go back in before the pain and fatigue hit too hard, but even she did it with the careful tone of someone asking permission rather than giving instruction. The infantryman nodded, because he understood his body better than anyone else in that moment. Already the effort of being upright, of descending, of feeling something so sharp after days of numb survival, had started hollowing him out from the inside. Still, when the orderly moved to turn the wheelchair, the dog rose at once and stepped beside it, following as if escort duty had always belonged to him. That caused the first small problem. Hospital policy did not allow strays inside the treatment corridors, and everyone present knew it. The older security guard muttered an apology to the soldier before he even moved, then crouched and tried to guide the dog back with his hand out low and calm. The animal ignored him completely. It did not snarl or bark. It only stayed beside the chair until the entrance threshold itself stopped it. There it planted all 4 paws and refused the next inch of separation. The infantryman looked down, saw the panic beginning to flicker behind those tired eyes, and felt the answer come before he could censor it. "Leave the door cracked," he said. The nurse looked at him. "That's not really allowed." "Then bend the rule." He did not say it harshly. That made it harder to deny. A long beat passed. Then the older guard, who had long ago learned that rules and mercy were rarely born in the same room, reached for the outer door and propped it open by just enough that the dog could still see through the gap into the lobby. 5 minutes, he muttered to no one in particular. The nurse said nothing. The chair rolled back inside. The dog remained on the step exactly where the soldier could still see him over one shoulder. Neither looked away until the elevator doors closed. After that, recovery changed in a way no chart could cleanly document. The wound still needed time. The body still fought its own private battles every morning and night. Physical therapy remained brutal in the unglamorous way real healing often was. Standing for the first time without support left him trembling with sweat under his shirt. Relearning how to trust the injured side of his body felt, on some days, more humiliating than the injury itself. The therapists measured angles, weight distribution, breathing stability, stride confidence. He measured smaller things. Whether his hands shook less when alarm sounded. Whether he could close his eyes without the collapsed market returning immediately. Whether he could finish half a meal without the metallic taste of battlefield dust coming back into his mouth for no reason. And under all of those invisible measures, there was now a routine that slowly became the strongest part of his day. Morning, if he was steady enough, he asked to be wheeled down to the entrance. Afternoon, if the pain medication had not fogged him too heavily, he asked again. Sometimes he only sat in silence while the dog lay at his feet. Sometimes he tore meat from his own tray and offered small pieces until the animal stopped pretending not to be hungry. Sometimes he watched the dog sleep in bursts no longer than a few minutes at a time, always waking to check the soldier's face before settling again. The hospital staff began structuring around this unofficial ritual more than they admitted. A nurse from orthopedics quietly arranged his lower floor therapy sessions to end near courtyard hours. The tea seller started setting aside warm broth in a chipped bowl, pretending it was leftover waste. The cleaner who worked the entrance early every morning brought an old wool blanket from her home and left it folded near the wall, so the dog would have somewhere softer than concrete to sleep. The dog accepted these things only after first checking the soldier's position, as if everything in its life had reorganized itself around that one battered human body, learning how to remain present. He never gave the dog a name aloud during those first days. That mattered more than it seemed. Names made things official. Names implied ownership, permanence, and future. The infantryman did not yet trust himself with any of those. War had taught him what happened when men named tomorrow too confidently. So instead, he spoke to the dog in fragments, half orders, half confessions, all of them quieter than anyone else could hear. Eat. Stay out of the road. Not that nurse. She hates being barked at. You look terrible. You are stubborn. You shouldn't have waited that long. The dog responded to tone more than words. Sometimes with a blink. Sometimes by shifting closer. Sometimes by lifting his torn ear at exactly the point in the sentence where the soldier's voice betrayed more than he intended. One evening, just after sunset stained the upper hospital windows bronze and gray, the soldier found himself saying, "I thought you were gone after the evac." The dog lay with his chin over the soldier's boot and did not move except for the slow rhythm of breathing. That simple, steady breathing nearly undid him. Because being found again, by anything after violence, by anything that was not duty or protocol or pain, felt more intimate than he knew how to survive. He turned his face away toward the courtyard, jaw tight, and stayed silent until the old tea seller approached with her kettle and murmured without judgment, "Some creatures choose only once. After that, they are yours whether you ask for them or not." He almost laughed at that, but the sound died before it reached air. Not because it wasn't true. Because it was. The first real clue to what had happened between the dog and the soldier during the skirmish reached the hospital 3 days later through one of the surviving men from the infantryman's unit. He arrived on crutches with bruising still yellow-black along one side of his face, and sat in the courtyard while the dog watched him with suspicious but not hostile attention. "It wasn't just the ration," the man said after the usual hard, awkward conversation men had when discussing battle without naming grief too directly. The wounded infantryman turned his head slowly. "What?" The man adjusted the crutch under one arm and looked at the dog before continuing. "That mutt kept circling your position after you went down. We thought it was after scraps. Then when the second burst hit the wall, you tried to move and slid the wrong way. There was rebar and broken glass on one side, open fire lane on the other. The dog kept barking and darting toward the alley until you followed it." The infantryman stared at him. Memory, which had until then come in fragments, sharpened painfully. Smoke. Heat. The dog stopping, turning, insisting. "You saw that?" "Part of it." The other soldier's voice softened. "Later, when we dragged you to the evac point, that animal snapped at one of the men trying to roll you flat because your wound was opening. It kept trying to get at your hand, not your throat. Like it wanted to make sure you were still in there." Silence settled after that, thick and private. The dog, bored or uninterested in human explanation, lowered himself at the infantryman's feet and put his head across the bandaged boot. The man on crutches shook his head once and said the thing everyone had felt but no one had wanted to turn into sentiment too early. It didn't just follow you. It chose you on the ground. The soldier carried that sentence for the rest of the day. Chose you. It sounded too simple for what the desert had been. Too clean. Yet the more he turned it over, the less he could deny it. The battlefield had offered the dog every reason to vanish forever. Noise, fire, men, vehicles, blood, terror, everything that usually drove stray animals into the farthest shadows they could find. And still it had stayed. Not because it was tame. Not because it belonged to anyone. Not because it expected safety in return. But because somewhere between shared hunger, shared danger, and one brief act of mercy, a line had formed. The soldier knew what it meant when men chose each other under fire. He had built his life around that logic once. You move because the man beside you is moving. You hold because he is still alive. You return because leaving him does something to your own soul that never fully heals. He had simply never imagined such logic could exist between species with the same brutal purity. Hospital life shifted around them more openly after that story spread. one of the physicians from the trauma wing, a stern woman who previously complained about disruptions near the entrance, authorized the dog to remain in the outer courtyard so long as vaccinations could be arranged through a volunteer clinic. A young medic with a soft spot for lost causes borrowed a leash and failed entirely to use it because the animal obeyed no one except the soldier's hand and voice. The tea seller laughed when she saw that and said some bonds came before paperwork. A barber from the staff housing shaved matted fur from around the old scar on the dog's hindquarter. A kitchen worker began saving bone broth from evening stock pots. Bit by bit, the hospital stopped treating the animal as a stray problem and started treating him as part of the wounded man's recovery, even if no official document ever used those words. The infantryman noticed all of it. He noticed because gratitude had become sharper in him since the skirmish, stripped free of pride. He thanked the nurse, who cleaned the old ear wound. Thanked the guard, who looked the other way when the dog slipped under the outer awning during rain. Thanked the medic who brought an anti-parasite tablet hidden in a folded napkin. The staff, in turn, watched the impossible thing happen slowly in front of them. The soldier who barely spoke in the ward, who stared through pain and memory with the hard distance of a man not yet sure life still belonged to him, began speaking more when the dog was present. Small sentences first, then actual questions. Then, one afternoon, a laugh, brief and rusty, and almost disbelieving, when the dog stole half his sandwich with more energy than dignity. That same afternoon, the old tea seller brought something wrapped in cloth. Inside was a faded military-style collar she had found years earlier among roadside market cast-offs, sturdy enough for a strong dog, though worn at the edges. "He needs something better than ribs and stubbornness to hold on to," she said. The soldier took it, turning the collar slowly in his hands. The leather was cracked but intact. The buckle still worked. The dog watched from the ground with suspicious patience. For a long minute the soldier did nothing. Then he crouched carefully, pain flashing through his side, as the movement pulled healing tissue tight, and buckled the collar around the dog's neck. The animal stood completely still through the whole process, as if understanding ceremony even without words. When the strap settled into place, the soldier rested one hand at the side of the dog's throat, and finally said the first thing that sounded like a promise. "You're not sleeping on that concrete forever." The dog looked up at him with those same battlefield eyes, and for the first time since the desert, the soldier believed that maybe neither of them would. What would you do if the one creature that had stayed beside you longer than anyone else suddenly became the reason the rest of the world started looking at your pain differently? The hospital staff would later remember that change in pieces rather than one exact day, because the transformation happened the way most real ones did, quietly, unevenly, and only after enough small moments gathered into something no one could deny. The wounded infantryman still woke some nights with his breath caught in his throat, and the old desert heat burning behind his eyes even when the room around him was cool and dim. He still flinched at metal striking metal in the wrong way. He still had hours when conversation felt like lifting weight with a body not yet stitched strongly enough to bear it. But now, whenever those darker stretches came, there was the dog. Waiting at the entrance. Waiting beside the chair. Waiting beneath the window. Waiting through weather, through pain, through the humiliating slow pace of physical recovery, as if loyalty had reduced life to one command and one command only: remain. And because that animal remained, the soldier began to remain too. The first time he was allowed to walk the full length of the lower rehabilitation corridor without stopping, the dog was there waiting at the far glass doors. One therapist joked that the animal looked more serious than half the officers in the military district, but even she lowered her voice before saying it, because humor near that bond had started feeling like something that required respect. The soldier moved one step at a time with the measured caution of a man relearning trust in his own body. The wound through the torso had taken strength from him in ways his face refused to admit. The deep cut at his side pulled whenever he twisted too fast. His lungs still remembered trauma, and the shallow rise of his chest whenever effort came too quickly. Yet he kept going because the dog stood there watching him, as if every step was a battle report that mattered. When he finally reached the end of the corridor, breathing hard, and with sweat darkening the back of his shirt, the animal pressed once against his leg and looked up. No celebration. No frantic movement. Just that same old certainty. The therapist beside him wrote something on her clipboard, but what she remembered later was not the distance walked or the stability of the gait. It was the expression on the soldier's face when he looked down at the dog. The expression of a man discovering that survival felt less humiliating when somebody had waited to see it happen. By then, the hospital had largely surrendered to the reality that the stray was no longer only a stray. No one said ownership aloud, because military places were full of practical people who distrusted sentiment unless it arrived wrapped in discipline, but the signs were obvious. A shallow bed of folded blankets appeared near the sheltered side of the entrance wall. A medic from logistics came by one evening with a proper steel food bowl and pretended he had found it in storage. The cleaner who washed the lower courtyard every dawn moved the hose path, so the dog's sleeping area stayed dry. The older security guard stopped calling the animal a problem and started calling him the one at the door, which, in his language, was almost affection. But the most important change came from the soldier himself. One morning, after finishing half a tray of eggs and bread for the first time since surgery, he saved 2 pieces of meat under the napkin, carried them down in the wheelchair, and fed the dog by hand in full daylight where everyone could see. The animal took the food carefully, no longer with the frantic caution of a thing convinced all kindness would be withdrawn at the next movement. Trust had entered the body now. Hesitant. Scarred. Real. The soldier looked around at the staff pretending not to watch and said in a voice rough from underuse, "He eats before I do from now on." The tea-seller laughed softly at that. The nurse beside the chair did not laugh at all. She only nodded like she had just heard a medical order. But healing is dangerous when it begins to resemble hope, because hope invites memory to return with sharper edges. As the infantryman's body strengthened, his mind also became clearer, and clarity reopened places inside him that sedation had blurred. He started remembering more from the skirmish, and not all of it was survivable in easy silence. There had been a young private pinned behind the broken supply truck who kept calling for ammunition even after half his voice was gone. There had been another man, older, with a wife and 2 daughters, who had laughed the night before over bad tea and a terrible card game, and later bled out behind a collapsed market wall before evacuation ever reached him. There had been a radio request answered too late. Coordinates that did not match the actual thread line. A route that should have been secured and wasn't. The soldier carried those fragments back with him from sleep now, and some afternoons, even sitting in the courtyard beside the dog under calm weather, he would suddenly go distant in a way that frightened the staff more than shouting ever could have. His eyes would fix on some middle point no one else could see. One hand would tighten around the wheelchair arm. His breathing would flatten. The first few times, the dog noticed before anyone else. The animal would rise, move close, and rest his head against the soldier's thigh or place one paw on the boot, not demanding, not dramatic, just present enough to pull the man's awareness back toward touch and weight and the ordinary truth of the hospital courtyard. The tea seller said once, in a voice meant only for the nurse standing beside her, "That dog guards is mind the way soldiers guard doors." The nurse never forgot that sentence because it was true. The turning point came on a late afternoon when the desert followed him all the way into the open. A transport vehicle backfired near the outer gate. It was just one sharp, violent crack of bad machinery. Nothing more. But the sound split the courtyard wide open inside the soldier's body. He jerked so hard in the chair that the blanket slid off his lap. His head snapped toward the gate. His injured side seized. For one terrible second the hospital disappeared and the market ruins came back complete. Dust in the teeth, heat in the lungs, men shouting from broken walls, the certainty that the next movement might be the last thing a body ever chose. The medic crossing the yard stopped mid-step. The older guard turned instantly. The nurse nearest the entrance had just enough time to see the soldier's face before the dog was already there. The animal hit the side of the chair with his chest, paws braced, head forcing itself under the soldier's shaking hand until skin met fur. The pressure broke the moment. Not fully. Not cleanly. But enough. The soldier bowed over with one hard breath, like someone surfacing from deep water. One hand tangled in the dog's rough neck fur. The other gripped the wheelchair arm until the knuckles blanched. No one moved toward him too fast. They had learned better. The nurse crouched at a respectful distance and said quietly, "You're here." The soldier did not answer. He was still too close to the desert for language. The dog leaned harder into him. The old tea seller left her kettle and crossed the courtyard for the first time since the vigil began, laying one lined hand over the soldier's uninjured forearm for only a second before stepping away again. 3 living weights held him to the present: the dog, the woman's brief touch, the chair under his body, and little by little the war released him enough to breathe. Afterward he was angry. Not at them. At himself. That anger sat on him for the rest of the evening, while the dog lay beside the bed and watched from the floor, refusing to be sent back outside despite the nurse's half-hearted insistence. The soldier stared at the dark window long after lights out, and finally said what had been poisoning him all day. "I'm tired of falling apart in front of everyone." The room had only one witness, who could not answer in human words. The dog raised his head from the blanket on the floor and listened with the full solemnity of a creature who understood tone better than speech. "Out there," the soldier said quietly, "if you lost your nerve, people died. In here, one stupid sound, and I'm back in the dust like nothing changed." He let out a breath that nearly became a laugh and failed halfway through. "Some recovery." The dog stood, crossed the small gap to the bed, and rested his muzzle on the mattress beside the soldier's hand. The simplicity of that gesture undid more of his anger than any comforting sentence could have. Because the animal did not care whether he was still strong in the old ways. It cared whether he was there. Breathing. Present. Reachable. The next morning a military psychologist came by, sent likely by someone who had watched too much and trusted silence too little. The soldier expected the usual controlled conversation about symptoms, recovery, adaptation, resilience, support structure. What he got instead was a middle-aged man who sat in the courtyard across from him, while the dog lay between them, and said, after a long glance at the animal, "You know, everyone thinks that dog is waiting for you. I think it's doing something more difficult." The soldier said nothing. The psychologist waited. Finally he asked, "What?" The man folded his hands. "I think it's proving to you that being found does not make you weak." The sentence landed with such clean force that the soldier looked away toward the courtyard wall and did not speak again for several minutes. But when he finally did, it was not to reject the idea. It was to ask the first honest question he had asked anyone in a long while. How do you come back from a place where part of you thinks you should have stayed with the ones who didn't? The psychologist did not answer immediately. He watched the dog breathe in the dustlight, watched the way the animal's body stayed angled toward the soldier even in sleep. "Sometimes," he said at last, "you come back because something waits for you until you believe you're allowed to." That conversation changed the soldier more than he admitted. He still disliked being examined with words. He still preferred silence to most forms of sympathy. But after that he began speaking in more complete truths. To the psychologist sometimes. to the nurse, who brought dressing supplies, to the dog most of all. He spoke about the skirmish in fragments, then in sequences. About the guilt of hearing a young man call for help from beyond a wall he could not cross. About the shame of being loaded onto evacuation before others. About the way the desert stayed inside the nose and throat long after the body was clean. Some of those confessions came while the dog slept at his feet. Some came while he hand-fed the animal from his own lunch tray. Some came while he slowly brushed burrs and dirt from the rough coat with a stolen hospital comb. The dog did not heal him in any magical way. It did something harder. It gave him a place to put the truth without fear that it would be judged, corrected, or filed away. By the end of the second week, he could walk short distances without the wheelchair. By the end of the third, he could make it to the entrance steps under his own strength, though the dog stayed so close along his right side that one nurse joked the animal had appointed himself unofficial physical therapy staff. The soldier almost smiled at that. Almost. One evening, under low sunset light that turned the hospital wall bronze and soft, he sat on the concrete step with one hand resting against the dog's neck and asked the question he had kept hidden because answering it would mean admitting the future existed again. "What am I supposed to do with you when they discharge me?" The dog lifted his head and looked at him as if the question itself were foolish. The older guard, overhearing from his post nearby, muttered dryly, "Looks to me like that decision's already been made." The soldier did not respond, but later that night, lying awake with the dog sleeping just inside the door of his room for the first time with official permission, he realized the guard was right. The war had not left him alone. The hospital had not healed him alone. And whatever waited after discharge would not be walked alone either. What would you do if the one bond that kept a wounded soldier anchored to the world suddenly forced him to face the future he had been avoiding since the day he was carried in through those emergency doors? By the fourth week, the hospital had become too small for denial. Bodies healed on schedules whether men were emotionally ready or not, and paperwork moved with a cold kind of optimism that never asked if the soul had kept pace. Discharge planning began in quiet administrative ways at first, forms placed at the end of the bed, follow-up appointments penciled onto cards, medication instructions clipped under discharge summaries, conversations about restricted movement, lifting limitations, wound care, and supervised outpatient trauma review. But beneath all of that lived the real question, the one everyone around him could sense even before he spoke it aloud. What happened to the dog when he left? The staff pretended to treat it as a practical problem, because practical problems were easier to hold than emotional ones. The security guard said the district wouldn't allow an unregistered stray wandering the outer roads forever. The nurse from trauma pointed out that the animal needed proper treatment for the old leg injury, parasites, and whatever neglect had almost reduced him to bone. The tea seller merely snorted and said the animal had already chosen, so the human would have to catch up. The soldier listened to them all and said very little, because the truth was far more frightening than any vaccination schedule or base regulation. Taking the dog meant accepting continuity. It meant admitting that what had happened in the desert and at the hospital entrance was not a temporary accident of survival, but the beginning of something that would follow him beyond the safety of monitored hallways and familiar faces. It meant building a life around another living thing again. Men who had lost enough knew how dangerous that was. The dog, of course, treated the question as already settled. By then he no longer slept outside the emergency entrance unless forced there by visiting hour restrictions or cleaning rotations. He had been bathed twice by a volunteer veterinary technician who worked the military district on weekends and came away from the task with soaked clothes, scratched forearms, and shining eyes because under the dirt and fear there had indeed been a Real dog waiting to emerge. The black antan coat came back first, then the shape of the shepherd beneath it. Lean but strong-boned, scarred yet unmistakably built for endurance and alertness. He was still painfully thin, but not in the hopeless way he had looked on the first day. Food had started doing its work. Rest had started doing its work. Safety, reluctantly accepted, had started doing its work. The torn ear remained. The old scar over the hindquarter remained. A stiffness in one rear leg remained when he rose too quickly from cold concrete. But now hospital staff no longer described him as the stray at the entrance. They called him the soldier's dog, whether paperwork agreed or not. He followed the infantryman through the courtyard on permitted walks, waited outside physical therapy, slept near the lower ward when allowed, and developed a quiet understanding of routines that made him look less like a rescued animal and more like an old companion rediscovered. Every time the soldier sat, the dog checked line of sight to the nearest door before settling. Every time a sudden sound broke the wrong way in the yard, the dog rose before the soldier flinched. Every time memory dragged the wounded man half a step backward into himself, the dog corrected for it with presence and touch and patience. The hospital staff noticed all of it. So did the soldier, which made the coming separation feel less like logistics and more like betrayal if he got it wrong. His room changed too. Not physically at first, but in atmosphere. A man who expected to leave eventually began unconsciously arranging the world around him with small forward-looking habits. He folded the blanket each morning instead of leaving it crumpled. He shaved more regularly. He forced himself to finish meals even when appetite lagged behind need. He started reading the discharge packet instead of ignoring it. Some evenings he sat by the window with the dog at his feet and stared not at the emergency entrance anymore, but beyond the hospital wall where the road bent toward the military housing district and, farther still, toward the civilian edges of the city where anonymous life continued whether one man healed or not. The thought of returning there unsettled him more than any corridor alarm now. War, for all its violence, had a terrible clarity. So did hospitalization. Pain had a schedule. Medications had names. Procedures followed protocols. But ordinary life? Ordinary life expected choices no superior officer would make on your behalf. Where to live. How to sleep. What to do with memory. Whether to speak. Whether to stay alone. Whether to care for something that now looked at you as if your existence had become part of its own map of the world. The first time he voiced that fear, he did not say it to the psychologist or the nurse or any of the men from his unit, who came by carrying awkward jokes and battlefield updates. He said it to the dog late one night after the corridor lights dimmed and the hospital settled into that strange half-silence where machines still whispered and distant footsteps still passed, but the day had finally loosened its grip. The dog lay on the blanket near the bed, with his head resting over one paw, one ear lifting every time the soldier shifted. "I don't know how to do this right," the soldier said into the darkness. "Out there I knew the rules. In here I learned new ones. But after?" He let out a breath and stared at the ceiling. "What if I take you with me, and it still isn't enough to keep either of us from falling apart?" The dog stood, crossed the small room, and placed both front paws against the side of the bed, resting his muzzle on the mattress near the soldier's hand. No panic. No demand. Just closeness. The soldier closed his eyes at that, because answers delivered without language were the hardest to argue against. He rested his hand over the dog's neck and, for a long time, neither of them moved. The next morning the battalion liaison arrived with the kind of expression soldiers wore when trying to combine official duty with actual concern and failing to hide the second beneath the first. He carried 2 folders, one medical, one administrative, and sat in the courtyard across from the infantryman while the dog lay between them in the patch of weak winter sun. The liaison talked through the usual things first: continued leave status, review board timing, whether the soldier wanted reassignment evaluation later or medical separation if recovery complications persisted, the possibility of light duty after extended rehabilitation, names of 2 men from the unit still under treatment elsewhere. The wounded soldier listened, asked only the necessary questions, and signed where he had to. Then the liaison, clearly saving something for last, opened the second folder and pulled out a document from District Animal Control and Military Housing Administration. "You know they can't keep pretending not to see him forever," he said, nodding toward the dog. "If you want him with you, this has to get done before discharge." The soldier stared at the paperwork. Registration approval pending. Vaccination compliance. Temporary housing exception for recovered working breed stray under personal responsibility. It looked absurdly bureaucratic for what had happened between a battlefield and a hospital entrance. Yet there it was, official proof that even loyalty had to pass through forms eventually. "Who pushed this through?" he asked. The liaison gave the faintest smile. "The head trauma nurse. The old woman with the T card. That security guard who acts like he hates everybody. And, for reasons I still don't understand, the surgeon who opened your chest." The soldier looked down at the papers for a long time. Then he signed. That should have settled it. In some ways it did. The hospital staff were delighted in the restrained way professionals allowed themselves to be delighted when trying to preserve dignity. The vet technician brought a proper collar and checked the leg again, confirming an old poorly healed injury that would always leave a slight limp, but not enough to limit a good life. The nurse from trauma handed over extra bandages. "For both patients," pretending not to mean the dog when she said it. The tea seller clicked her tongue and declared that now the animal could stop behaving like a ghost and start behaving like family. Even the surgeon, a severe man who normally treated all emotion like a secondary infection, paused by the bed one afternoon and said, without preface, "You both got lucky. Don't waste it." Then he left before gratitude could make the room awkward. But if the hospital felt relief, the soldier felt something more complicated. Signing the forms had made the future real. The dog was now, in every meaningful way, his responsibility. Not in the sentimental language strangers like to use. In the harder, quieter language of feeding, sheltering, care, patience, and remaining present. Men wounded in war often feared violence less than they feared being needed after it. Need implied continuity. Continuity implied risk. And risk, once you had watched enough good things die, could feel indistinguishable from folly. He was still learning how to walk the courtyard stairs unassisted when the first real test of that new future arrived. It came in the form of a transport bus. The hospital regularly received convoys carrying wounded from outer sectors, and by then, the soldier had learned how to brace when military vehicles pulled through the gate. He was not cured. He was better prepared. There was a difference. On that afternoon, he sat beneath the awning while the dog lay half across one boot and the tea seller poured weak tea into paper cups for 2 orderlies arguing quietly over football. The weather was dry, the sky pale, the kind of ordinary afternoon that allowed people to imagine nothing terrible would happen for at least an hour. Then the transport bus came in fast, brakes hissing too sharply, one side panel dusted with desert sand still clinging from a long road movement. The sound alone tightened something in his chest. The smell finished the job. Hot metal, old dust, sweat, dried blood, engine heat, canvas, battlefield residue cooked into fabric. His body reacted before thought. The cup in his hand trembled. Breath shortened. Pulse rose. The courtyard blurred around the edges as the past shoved itself hard against the present again. But this time something new happened. Before the fear fully closed around him, the dog rose, not to the soldier first, but to the bus. He moved 10 feet forward, stood square between the vehicle and the seated man, and watched the unloading process with the full alert gravity of a sentry taking post. Then, After the first stretcher came down and the sound of rushed boots hit the concrete, the dog looked back over his shoulder as if to report, "I see it. I am here." The soldier followed that look and, because of it, did not disappear as deeply into the memory as he might have weeks earlier. The panic still came. The body still shook. But now it met resistance. Presence. Pattern. The dog had not just become comfort. He had become warning, anchor, and witness all at once. That night the psychologist listened to the story and nodded slowly. "You think you're taking care of him," he said. "And you are? But you also need to understand something harder. He has started taking care of you in ways that don't threaten your pride because he never asked you to explain them." The soldier looked toward the window where the dog slept curled under the chair, finally secure enough to sleep deeply. That sounds dangerously close to therapy. The psychologist almost smiled. Then don't call it therapy. Call it loyalty. The soldier leaned back against the pillow, sore and tired and strangely less defensive than he would once have been. And what if I'm not good at receiving that? The answer came without hesitation. Then learn. Because some men spend their whole lives surviving and never figure out that being loved after survival is a different skill. 2 days before discharge, the soldier was cleared for one supervised walk beyond the hospital entrance into the district garden path outside the gate. He almost refused. Not because he was physically unable. He could walk with some strain and unevenness now, but he could walk. He almost refused because going beyond the gate meant crossing the invisible line between protected recovery and ordinary uncertainty. The nurse who knew him best recognized the hesitation instantly and said the exact thing needed. "You don't have to trust the whole world today," she told him. "Just trust the next 10 steps." So he did. He crossed the entrance slowly with the dog on the new collar walking close against his right leg, no leash needed because the bond had already done what training usually took months to build. Outside the gate, the city air smelled different from the hospital air, less antiseptic, more dust, traffic, bread smoke, old concrete, and people living despite everything. The dog paused, scanned the road, then resumed pace only when the soldier moved. They made it to the first row of low trees, then the second, then back again. 10 steps became 20. 20 became a loop. By the time they re-entered the courtyard, the tea seller was smiling into her kettle like someone who had just seen the end of a prayer she never admitted making. That evening the soldier sat on the edge of the bed while the dog rested against his shin, and for the first time he let himself imagine the thing he had avoided naming. A room after discharge. A mat on the floor. Morning walks. Shared silence that did not accuse. Nights that might still break apart but would no longer break apart alone. He looked down at the dog and finally said the words he had been circling ever since the battlefield. "All right," he murmured. "You come with me." The dog lifted his head immediately, as if he had understood every sentence that had ever mattered between them, and had merely been waiting for the human to catch up. What would you do if the moment you finally decided to carry loyalty with you into the future was also the moment the past reminded you it still had claws buried in your back? The soldier learned that recovery never moved in a straight line the day before his discharge, when the hospital ward that had slowly become familiar turned strange again under the pressure of one simple request. A military investigator arrived just after noon carrying a thin file and the careful politeness of a man who knew he was about to reopen something that medicine had only just managed to close. He was not there for discipline, blame, or formal review. At least not officially. He said he only needed clarification on the skirmish, a few final sequence details to reconcile testimony, route timings, and the breakdown that left part of the unit exposed near the ruined market sector. The soldier almost sent him away. Every instinct in him wanted to protect the little bit of quiet he had managed to build at the edge of that hospital room. Clean sheets, measured pain, the dog sleeping under the chair, the knowledge that tomorrow he would finally leave those corridors behind. But war rarely cared what timing felt humane, and so the investigator sat down in the hard visitor's chair while the dog lifted his head from the floor and watched him with immediate suspicion. The questions began small enough. Vehicle positions. Which alley the unit had shifted toward after the first burst? Who was nearest the wounded private when the second line collapsed? How long between the first failed radio call and the arrival of the delayed support truck? The soldier answered because the answers existed whether he spoke them or not. But facts in military language had a cruel way of turning back into images the moment they left the mouth. Dust rising from shattered masonry. A comrade half hidden behind a wheel hub, reaching for magazines that were no longer there. The wrong route being marked safe. The scream of metal as a market awning collapsed under fire and trapped one of the youngest men in the unit, where no one could reach him without exposing three more. He felt the old pressure building behind his ribs as the questions continued. His voice stayed even. His face stayed controlled. Only the dog noticed first. The animal stood slowly from the floor, crossed the room, and placed himself between the bed and the investigator's chair without growling, without baring teeth, simply existing there like a living boundary line that said enough. The investigator stopped mid-question and looked at the dog, then back at the soldier. "We can continue later," he said quietly. The soldier stared at the opposite wall for a long second before answering. "No." Then, after an even longer pause, "Finish it." He needed the end of it more than comfort in that moment. Or maybe he needed to prove to himself that he could endure being looked at by the past and not collapse under it. The investigator asked the final question very gently, which somehow made it worse. "When you moved from the broken stall line into the service alley, who directed you there?" The room went still around that sentence. The hospital faded for one hot, terrible second, and the soldier was back under smoke and stone with blood soaking through the front of his uniform, and the world narrowing to pain, dust, and whatever came next. He remembered trying to crawl, remembered his hands slipping in his own blood, remembered not understanding why he had turned left instead of right until he saw the skeletal stray dart ahead through rubble and stop, barking once from the gap between two collapsed walls. He had followed because the dog had become the only thing in that moment moving with certainty. The investigator waited. The soldier swallowed once. "A dog," he said. The investigator did not react with disbelief, only wrote something down and asked, "The same dog now with you?" The soldier nodded. The investigator's eyes shifted toward the animal standing guard by the bed. "Then that's in the report too." When he left, he did so with the solemn respect of a man who understood that truth could sound absurd and still remain truth. But the damage had already been done. The past was awake in the room again. That afternoon, for the first time in days, the soldier could not bring himself to go down to the courtyard. The nurse noticed. The tea seller noticed when the dog did not appear at the entrance. Even the older security guard noticed because habit had made their daily timing part of the hospital's own small rhythm. Inside the room, the soldier sat on the edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees and stared at the floor while the dog paced once, twice, then settled directly against his shin. The animal knew something was wrong, but not what shape it took in human memory, and so he did what loyalty always did when language failed. It stayed. The soldier dragged a hand down over his face and let out a breath that felt like defeat. "Tomorrow I walk out," he said quietly, not sure whether he was speaking to the dog or to the part of himself still afraid of the world beyond the gate. "And I still don't know if I'm leaving as somebody alive or just somebody not dead yet." The dog lifted his head and watched him. "There's a difference." He almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't care, do you? You don't need me whole. You just need me there." The dog moved closer until the full weight of his side pressed against the soldier's leg. That answer, simple and physical and impossible to argue with, did something inside him that nothing from the investigator, the doctors, or the psychologists had done all day. It did not erase the skirmish. It did not forgive the dead. It did not make the system that failed them less broken. It just reminded him that life was still making claims on him from the present tense. By evening, the nurse, who had helped him through the worst nights, came in carrying not a medication tray, but a folded set of civilian clothes and a small paper bag from the hospital kitchen. "Since you're determined to leave tomorrow," she said, "you can at least stop looking like a patient tonight." He looked at the clothes, then at her. "I didn't ask for those." "I know." She placed them on the chair above the sleeping dog. "Sometimes recovery has to arrive before the man agrees to invite it in." From the bag she pulled out roasted chicken scraps, cooked rice, and a boiled egg. Not for him. For the dog. "Final pre-discharge feast," she said. The soldier looked down at the animal and felt a strange tightness in his throat. Gratitude had become dangerous lately because it opened the same part of him that grief used. "Thank you," he said. The nurse shrugged as if she had done nothing remarkable. Then she paused at the door and added, "The first day outside will feel louder than you expect. Don't mistake that for failure." After she left, he changed slowly into the civilian clothes, each movement reminding him of the wound in his side, the stiffness in his chest, the weakness still hiding in muscles that had not yet rebuilt. When he was done, he sat on the floor beside the dog and fed him from the paper bag piece by piece under the dim ward light. The dog ate carefully, no longer like a creature expecting theft at every second, but like one who had finally accepted that tomorrow's food might also exist. That mattered more than the meal itself. Night came quietly, and with it came one final visit from the psychologist. No clipboard this time. No formal questions. He stood at the window, looking down toward the courtyard where the emergency entrance glowed under soft lamps, and said, "You know, leaving here doesn't mean finishing anything." The soldier sat on the bed with one hand resting on the dog's collar. "I know." "Good." The psychologist turned toward him. "Because some men make the mistake of thinking discharge is a clean ending. It's not. It's a crossing." He glanced at the dog. "You're luckier than most. You're not crossing alone." The soldier was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the thing that had scared him most and therefore needed saying. "What if one day he looks at me and realizes he chose wrong?" The psychologist did not smile. He took the question seriously because it deserved seriousness. He waited outside a hospital entrance while half the world told him to leave. He said, "I don't think your dog has a history of careless decisions." After he was gone, the soldier lay awake longer than usual, one hand hanging over the side of the bed, so the dog could sleep with his muzzle against it. Outside, the hospital carried on in its sleepless rhythm, doors opening, distant wheels moving, voices low in corridors, one more ambulance passing the outer gate. But something inside the room had settled. Not certainty. He no longer expected certainty from life. Something quieter. Readiness, maybe. Or at least willingness. Morning arrived pale and cool. Discharge happened with all the strange anticlimax such things always carried. Papers signed. Dressings checked. Medication reviewed. Follow-up dates written. The attending surgeon delivered strict instructions in a tone that implied direct personal insult if they were ignored. The trauma nurse hugged him unexpectedly, and then stepped back before emotion embarrassed either of them. The older security guard pretended he had only come upstairs to verify the escort timing, and then spent 5 full minutes explaining how traffic outside the hospital gate was worse in the late morning. The tea seller sent up sweet tea in a metal cup. For strength, though everyone knew the gesture was blessing disguised as refreshment. The dog, freshly colored and cleaner than he had likely been in years, stood through all of it with one unwavering conclusion in his eyes. Movement was beginning, and he would be part of it. When the soldier finally walked out through the same emergency doors the dog had watched for so many days, the hospital courtyard looked completely different from how it had looked when he first entered half-conscious on a stretcher. Sunlight touched the cracked concrete. Nurses crossed between buildings carrying charts and paper cups. The old woman at the tea cart raised one hand in farewell. Two orderlies paused just long enough to see the moment happen properly. The soldier stopped at the top of the entrance steps, one hand on the rail, the other holding the folded discharge papers he already hated. The dog stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly aligned. For 1 second neither moved. The emergency doors whispered shut behind them. The hospital, with all its pain and all its unexpected mercy, became a place at their backs rather than around them. Then the dog took the first step. Not away in panic. Not ahead in restless energy. Just one calm step forward, then a glance back, exactly the same way he had looked at the soldier in the desert alley between broken walls. "Come with me." The soldier saw it instantly, and almost broke under the weight of what that meant. Battlefield, entrance vigil, recovery ward, discharge gate, through all of it the dog had kept offering the same thing in different forms. Not rescue from pain. Movement through it. He let out a slow breath, adjusted the light bag hanging from his shoulder, and stepped down beside him into the open day. The hospital staff watched them go in silence. Because every person there understood, in their own private way, that what was leaving that courtyard was not only a discharged soldier and a once stray dog. It was a promise that loyalty forged under fire had survived long enough to become a life. What would you do if the first day of freedom felt less like freedom and more like stepping into a world that no longer knew where to put a man who had come back from war with too much silence in his chest, and a dog who refused to let him disappear inside it? The soldier learned very quickly that the hospital had protected him from more than pain. It had protected him from decisions. Outside the gate there were no nurses measuring blood pressure, no medication carts arriving with exact timing, no security men quietly making space for a scarred animal at the entrance, no familiar corridor lights holding the night at a controlled distance. There was only the city, dry and loud and indifferent in the way cities often were, with traffic sliding past in bursts of noise, market carts creaking over bad pavement, men calling to each other from mechanic stalls and tea stands, and wind dragging dust down the road in thin, restless sheets. He stood on the far side of the hospital wall for one long second with a discharge bag in one hand, and his side aching under clean civilian clothes, and he felt a small hard panic rise in him, not because the world was openly threatening, but because it was open at all. The dog sensed it instantly. He did not pull ahead or circle nervously. He stepped close against the soldier's right leg and matched his pace exactly, forcing the body into motion one calm stride at a time. That was how they crossed the first street. That was how they found the waiting military transport arranged to take the soldier to temporary recovery housing. That was how they entered the next chapter of survival, not as men usually imagined it, with victory or clarity, but with one wounded human and one half-healed dog teaching each other how not to retreat. The recovery housing sat at the edge of a military residential district, where low tan buildings faced a courtyard planted with stubborn dry trees and narrow strips of grass that never fully defeated the dust. It was meant for short-term convalescence, the kind of place built for men recovering enough to manage basic life, but not yet ready for full reassignment or discharge into the civilian world. The room they gave him was simple: one bed, one chair, a metal wardrobe, a bathroom with cracked tile and water that ran hot only when the pipes were in a generous mood, and a small balcony that looked over the outer wall toward the road. It should have felt temporary. It did. But after the hospital, even temporary space carried a dangerous kind of possibility. He set his bag down on the bed, looked around once, and then looked at the dog, who had entered the room slowly, nose working every corner with disciplined caution rather than curiosity. The animal checked the door first, then the bathroom, then the balcony threshold. Only after all exits and angles had been read did he turn back and sit near the bed, as if declaring the room acceptable so long as the soldier remained inside it. The soldier let out a breath he had not known he was holding, and sat down hard on the mattress, because standing too long still cost more than he liked. "Temporary," he muttered. The dog blinked at him. "Yeah, I know." He almost smiled. "You've already moved in." The first problem was food. The second was sleep. The dog had improved under hospital care, but he was still too thin, still carrying the habits of starvation, still learning that meals could happen daily without a fight or theft or sudden disappearance. The soldier found a nearby butcher stall willing to sell scraps cheap after hearing part of the story from one of the medics, who had apparently told it faster than any official report ever moved. He bought rice, broth, and small cuts he could cook soft enough for a recovering animal body to handle. He found 2 bowls in a supply market and a cheap woven mat for the floor, though the dog ignored the mat entirely, and slept by the door the first night as if he had taken personal responsibility for every hinge in the building. The soldier tried the bed, and failed at sleep almost immediately. Hospital noise had been constant, but it had also been predictable. Here, every sound felt unvetted. A truck backfiring in the distance snapped him awake. Footsteps in the hallway did the same. Somewhere after midnight a neighbor coughed behind a wall, and he sat upright before fully understanding he was no longer in a combat ward, no longer under attack, no longer in the market ruins, not even in the hospital. Just in a room. Just in a bed. Just alive. The dog rose from the door at the first hard inhale and came to the bedside without command. He put his muzzle against the mattress edge until the soldier's hand found his head in the dark. They stayed like that for a long time. No words. The soldier eventually lay back down with one hand still hanging over the edge so fur remained under the fingers. That was how he slept the rest of the night, badly, unevenly, but still more honestly than he would have without the dog there. Morning brought routine, and routine brought relief. He learned quickly that if he did not structure the hours would fill themselves with memory. So he built a day the way men built field shelters, with whatever remained. Wake early. Clean the wound. Walk the dog before the heat turned cruel. Eat something even when appetite failed. Stretch as instructed. Breathe when the pain in the torso tried to make breathing shallow again. Brush the dog's coat. Check the old scar on the hind leg. Sit on the balcony for 10 minutes, whether he wanted air or not. No alcohol. No sitting in the dark too long. No skipping meals, because the body was no longer on battlefield terms, and would not be treated like an enemy asset. It was ugly discipline, private and uncelebrated, but it worked just enough to get them through the first 3 days. On the 4th, the dog brought him a problem he had not anticipated. A pack of street dogs gathered near the outer market lane just after sunrise, half-starved, rangy, defensive, the way abandoned animals in military districts often became when food and fear trained them into rough hierarchies. The shepherd stopped dead the moment he saw them. His whole body changed. Not panic. Recognition. The old life still lived under the cleaner coat, the fuller belly, the new collar. He had come from roads like these. Maybe from battles over garbage piles, over sleeping corners, over the right not to be driven off by stronger bodies. The pack noticed him too. 3 moved closer. One scarred tan male gave a low warning growl. The soldier saw the dog's muscles tighten and understood the danger immediately. Not because he feared the shepherd losing a fight. He feared what it might do to something inside the animal to be thrown back into that world after finally being given another. He stepped forward before the tension fully ignited, putting himself between the pack and the dog in one clear hard movement. Most men would have seen only a recovering patient with an awkward stance and a healing wound. The street dog saw something else. Authority. Not dominance exactly, but the shape of a body that had stood in violence before and would not step back now. He clapped once, sharp and loud, then bent for a stone he never needed to throw because the pack had already decided this was no longer worth the cost. They backed off in ragged stages and vanished between market stalls. When the soldier turned around, the German shepherd was staring at him with the same battlefield intensity he had once used in the smoke-filled alley. The soldier reached down, touched the rough side of the dog's neck, and said quietly, "You don't go back." The dog leaned once against his leg as if the sentence mattered. On the 6th day came the phone call. Not from command. Not from the psychologist. Not from any official channel. It came from a number he almost ignored because so many military calls carried either bureaucracy or bad news, and he had no appetite for either. But he answered, and on the other side was one of the men from his unit, the one who had come to the hospital on crutches and told the fuller version of how the dog had tried to keep contact with him at the evacuation line. The man sounded stronger now, but only just. "You got him?" he asked without preface. The soldier looked down at the dog sleeping half in sun by the balcony door. "Yeah." There was a pause, then a breath like somebody sitting carefully through pain. "Good. I wanted to tell you something before somebody else tells it wrong." The soldier said nothing. He knew that tone. It was the tone used before truth arrived carrying weight. "One of the boys from the forward perimeter said that after they loaded you, that dog ran behind the evac truck until it disappeared. They thought that was it. But later, at the field collection point, they saw him again. Same dog. Same torn ear. No idea how he crossed that distance alive." The soldier closed his eyes. Outside, traffic moved beyond the wall. Dust lifted in the heat. "And?" he asked. The answer came softer. "And while they were stabilizing you, he stayed under the barrier near your boots. Wouldn't leave even when rotor wash hit. Somebody finally tried to drive him off with a strap, and he bit the strap clean through." Silence stretched between them after that. The man on the other end spoke again before hanging up. "You know what that means, right?" The soldier looked down at the sleeping dog and answered in a voice almost too low for himself to hear. "Yeah." It meant the vigil at the hospital had not begun there. It had begun the second the battlefield tried to separate them, and the dog refused the separation. That evening memory found him harder than usual. He sat on the floor with his back to the bed, and the dog stretched beside him, while dust pressed purple and bronze across the balcony. The room felt smaller after the phone call, as if the story had suddenly become too large for walls. He remembered the evacuation line better now. The rough hands dragging him. The half-heard arguments over triage order. The animal under the barrier, impossible and filthy and determined. He remembered one medic saying, "This thing thinks it belongs to him." At the time, he had barely been conscious enough to understand this sentence. Now it echoed differently. Belongs. The word was dangerous. Men belong to units, to orders, to war, to grief, to memory. Belonging after all that could become terrifying because it asked something beyond survival. It asked continuity. Care. Return. He said the thought aloud without planning to. "I don't know if I can keep what stays." The dog opened one eye, then lifted his head fully. The soldier shook his own once, frustrated by how childish the sentence sounded and how true it felt anyway. "Everything that stayed before got hurt." The dog stood, crossed the tiny room, and pressed his head under the soldier's hand until touch happened whether invited or not. The simplicity of that demand broke whatever remained of the defense. The soldier bowed his head once, and for a few seconds let grief move through him without fighting it into discipline. Not loud grief. No dramatic collapse. Just the deep exhausted grief of a man who had finally realized that the thing waiting outside the hospital entrance had not only saved his life once in the desert, but had refused every later chance to let that life become lonely again. By the end of the first week outside, the district had begun recognizing them as a pair. The butcher put aside better scraps. The pharmacist on the corner started stocking bandage-wrapped safe for animals after noticing the old hind leg scar stiffened in the mornings. A neighbor from 2 doors down, a widow with a garden of dry herbs and quiet eyes, began leaving a bowl of fresh water near the stairwell with the kind of politeness that did not intrude on pain. Children in the courtyard stopped playing too close to the soldier when they saw the hardness in his face, but they smiled at the dog when they thought he wasn't looking. Routine, once built, started turning into life. Not the old life. That one was gone. But a new one, narrow and careful and scarred, was beginning to hold. Then, just as he started to believe that maybe healing could remain small and honest, a military vehicle stopped outside the housing block after sunset, and an officer stepped out carrying an envelope marked for personal delivery. Inside was a summons. Not a punishment. Not a commendation. Worse. A request for the soldier to appear before a closed military review regarding the desert skirmish, the route failure, and related unresolved field anomalies. The soldier read that phrase twice. Then a third time. Related unresolved field anomalies. The dog, sensing the old tension rise back into the room, stood and moved close. Because somewhere inside that official language lived the first hint that the bond born under fire was about to pull them both back toward the truth of what really happened in the desert. What would you do if the war that nearly killed you refused to stay buried in memory and instead reached back into your new life with official language, sealed rooms, and the quiet promise that somebody had lied about what happened on that desert road? The soldier read the summons 3 times under the weak yellow light of the recovery room, while the dog stood pressed against his leg, and the evening call to prayer drifted thinly over the district walls. The paper itself was clean, formal, and almost bloodless in tone, which somehow made it more dangerous. A closed military review. Route failure. Skirmish analysis. Related unresolved field anomalies. Men in uniform love phrases like that because phrases like that turn damaged reality into something neat enough to file. But he had lived inside the reality those words were trying to flatten. He knew what route failure meant in human terms. It meant a wrong corridor marked safe. It meant a unit pushed into a kill box while believing their flank had been cleared. It meant dead men, burning vehicles, bad radio traffic, and one wounded infantryman crawling through dust and blood while a skeletal stray refused to leave him. As for unresolved field anomalies, he had no doubt at all what that meant. It meant the dog. Not because they wanted to honor it. Because they wanted to explain it away, contain it, or use it to patch over whatever part of the official story no longer held together under witness accounts. He folded the paper once, then again, and felt the old cold anger rise under his healing ribs. The dog lifted his head and watched him with that same absolute attention he had carried from the battlefield to the hospital door, and from the hospital door into this narrow temporary life. "Yeah," the soldier said quietly. "I know." The animal did not need the rest of the sentence. He never did. Something had shifted. The room felt smaller. The future they had only just begun building had been interrupted by the past coming through the front gate wearing polished boots. He did not sleep much that night. Recovery had already taught him that official requests after combat were rarely simple, and never truly about closure. If command wanted only sequence clarification, it could have collected it through paperwork, line reports, or the investigator who already reopened the wound once. A closed review meant something else. It meant someone with authority had found a crack between the official version of the ambush and the testimonies now gathering around it. Maybe the route timings no longer matched. Maybe one of the dead had sent a final location ping that contradicted the map. Maybe the men who survived had all repeated the same impossible detail about a starving dog guiding a wounded infantryman out through rubble, when no marked escape line should have existed there at all. Or maybe, more dangerously, someone above them had noticed the wrong question emerging beneath those details. Who misreported the route? Who benefited from the delayed support? Why had the kill zone lined up so cleanly with the exact market district they were sent to secure? He lay on the bed with one hand hanging over the side so the dog could sleep with his head against it, and the old unease worked through him in layers. There was fear in it, yes, because fear was honest. Not fear of the officers in the review room. Fear of what remembering under official pressure might do to him. Fear of how close the truth might sit to the names of men already gone. Fear that if he stepped back into military machinery too deeply, the small fragile life beginning to form around him, and the dog would get swallowed by the same system that had almost taken both of them before. Sometime after midnight the dog stood up, circled once, then abandoned the floor entirely, and pushed his weight gently onto the edge of the mattress until the soldier made room. The movement was awkward, stubborn, and absolutely against any orderly version of rules, which made it feel like grace. For the first time since leaving the hospital, he slept with another living heartbeat against his side. Morning did not make the summons less real. It only made logistics begin. He had 24 hours to report to the district review building on the far side of the military quarter. He could have left the dog behind in the room, but the thought never fully formed before dying. Not because he believed the animal needed him every minute now. Because he had already learned too much about his own mind. The difference between walking into a room alone and walking into the same room after feeling the dog's shoulder brush his leg on the way there was no small thing. It was the difference between bracing and unraveling. So he did what he always did when uncertainty pressed too hard. He built routine around it. He cleaned the wound. Fed the dog first. Ate enough himself to avoid weakness later. Walked the outer courtyard loop twice despite the tightness in his side. Brushed the rough coat while the dog sat still under the balcony light, closing his eyes once when the comb hit a place behind the torn ear he liked. That detail almost undid him. Such simple trust. Such ordinary creature comfort after all they had crossed. "You're not coming into the room," he told the dog while adjusting the collar. "But you're coming with me." The dog looked up as if there had never been any version of events in which he would not. The review building was all hard angles, pale walls, and polished surfaces that reflected discipline without warmth. Guards at the outer gate checked his papers, looked once at the dog, and almost refused entry until a major from inside came down the steps, recognized the soldier's name, and after one measuring glance at the animal simply said, "He waits outside. No farther." The soldier nodded. The dog sat the moment the command in the tone became clear, taking position under the shade of a concrete overhang with eyes fixed on the main doors. It struck the soldier then, with strange force, that this was another threshold. Not a hospital entrance this time. Another set of doors. Another wait. Another promise that someone needed to come back through them alive in whatever way counted. He rested one hand briefly on the dog's neck before going in. "Stay." The animal did not move. Inside, the room was smaller than he expected and therefore worse. Long table. 3 officers. 1 recorder. 1 legal observer. 1 intelligence liaison whose face was smooth enough to hide everything, and whose eyes missed almost nothing. There was also the investigator from the hospital, which told the soldier this was not a separate inquiry at all, but an escalation. They began with routine language. Confirmation of identity. Conditions sufficient for testimony. Awareness of closed room classification. Then the question started and very quickly abandoned the safe administrative edges. Not only where were you positioned, not only when were you hit, but what did you observe before the first contact? Did you note any irregular movement along the eastern stalls? Did you see unfamiliar route markers? Did you hear any radio traffic inconsistent with your assigned frequency? He answered carefully, not because he wanted to protect command, but because truth mattered more than emotion in rooms like this. The more he spoke, the colder the officers became, not in hostility, but in concentration. They were hearing not merely battlefield chaos, but pattern. A route corridor wrongly marked. Support delayed beyond plausible error. One flank collapsing too cleanly. A private contractor convoy passing through the same district hours earlier, with documentation no one in his unit had been briefed on. Then the intelligence liaison finally placed a photograph on the table. It was grainy, pulled from distance, taken in the market sector not long before the ambush. In it, barely visible between broken walls and shadow, was the dog. Not near the soldier. Not after he was wounded. Before. The room went very quiet. "Did you see this animal before contact began?" the liaison asked. The soldier looked at the image and felt the desert come back not as panic this time, but as sharpening memory. The stray in shade. Watching. Existing at the edge of the patrol's awareness, while younger men joked and older ones checked corners. "Yes," he said. "Did anyone react?" "Not seriously." "Did the animal appear to be avoiding the eastern lane?" He looked up sharply. "What?" The liaison slid a second photo forward. This one marked with route arrows and later blast points. The eastern lane, the one command had effectively pushed them toward, was also the lane where local stray movement had disappeared from surveillance hours earlier. The western service alley, the one the dog later led him through after he was hit, showed repeated pre-contact movement by the same animal across multiple frames. The intelligence officer folded his hands. "We've been reviewing peripheral footage from roadside monitoring assets that were not initially included in the operation archive." Not initially included. There it was. The phrase that told him everything and nothing at once. Someone had held evidence back. Not out of incompetence. Out of choice. The dog had not simply saved him after the ambush. The dog had, unknowingly, been reading danger before the first shot ever fired. Avoiding the eastern lane. Crossing toward the only service gap not yet locked down. Doing exactly what a living creature with sharper instincts than any drone or officer might do when the ground ahead no longer smelled right. The soldier leaned back slowly despite the pull in his side. "You're telling me the dog knew the route was wrong before we did?" One of the officers answered before the liaison could. "We're telling you the animal's movement may indicate detected preparations our surveillance and route vetting failed to identify." Failed. Another bloodless word. Men died inside words like that. The review changed after that. It stopped being about his collapse under fire and became, in part, about everything the animal might have perceived. Smell of explosives. Human disturbance. Stress patterns in market alleys. Avoidance behavior. Whether the dog responded to particular buildings, vehicles, or men before the firefight. The soldier answered as best he could, but with each question a harder truth formed. The military machine was not interested in loyalty. It was interested in data, pattern, utility. If they concluded the dog's battlefield behavior held operational significance, there would be interest. Interest meant handlers, tests, detachment, maybe even confiscation under the polite language of evaluation or service suitability. The moment that realization landed, something in him went still in a dangerous way. The officers must have sensed it because the legal observer shifted and said, "This is exploratory only." The soldier looked at him and knew the sentence for what it was. Not a reassurance. A placeholder. Exploratory only meant no one had yet decided how far they intended to reach. He finished the testimony because leaving would help nothing. By the end, the officers had enough to reopen route accountability, and enough to start worrying about what else the original operation archive contained or concealed. When he stood to go, the liaison asked one final question that sounded almost casual and therefore mattered most. "Has the animal shown consistent attachment only to you?" The soldier held the edge of the chair for one breath before answering. "He chose me." Then he left before anyone could reframe the sentence into something useful. The dog was exactly where he had been told to stay. Same overhang. Same fixed gaze. Same rigid rise the second the doors opened. The soldier reached him in 6 long uneven steps and dropped one hand to the collar with more force than he intended, not hurting, just needing contact with something that had not spoken in codes for the last hour. The dog pressed into his leg at once, then looked up. Search. Confirm. Still here. Alive. The soldier exhaled a breath he had held through the entire review. On the drive back to housing he said nothing until they were alone again in the room. Then he crouched despite the pain and took the dog's face gently between both hands, staring into the dark eyes that had watched smoke, blood, hospital doors, and now one more official building without wavering. "They are not taking you," he said. The dog blinked once. "You hear me?" The answer was not in words. It was in the immediate lean forward, the quiet trust, the same impossible calm. But beneath that calm the soldier now understood the new danger clearly. The war was not finished trying to claim what had been born in it. And if command decided the shepherd was more valuable as an asset than as a companion, this would stop being about recovery and become a fight of another kind altogether. Part 9 thought for SIXS Part 9, what would you do if the one soul that had waded through blood, surgery, and every locked hospital door suddenly became the thing the system wanted to measure, categorize, and take from you under the cold language of necessity? The soldier understood that danger fully the morning after the review, because men trained in institutions learned to recognize the sound of interest before orders were ever spoken aloud. It was there in the second call requesting a behavioral observation follow-up. It was there in the too casual mention of transport availability should the animal need evaluation at a military canine facility. It was there in the polite way the officer on the line avoided the word take and replaced it with assess, as if softer language could disguise the shape of the hand reaching out. The soldier ended the call with a voice that remained level only because anger, once old enough, often stopped needing volume to become dangerous. Afterward he stood in the small recovery room with the receiver still in his hand and watched the dog sleeping near the balcony in a square of weak morning light, one torn ear twitching at distant traffic, chest rising slowly, body finally beginning to look less like famine and more like strength. The sight hit him with such force that he had to sit down. Not because he doubted what to do, because he knew exactly what he would do if anyone tried to turn that living bond into property. For the first time since the skirmish, the fear inside him was not about memory, pain, or whether he could rebuild a life. It was about losing the one creature that had chosen him without orders, paperwork, rank, or reward. The dog opened his eyes a second later and looked at him, as if he had heard the danger through silence alone. Then he rose, crossed the room, and rested his head against the soldier's knee with complete trust. That trust made the coming conflict simpler than any military room would ever understand. The answer was already no. He did not spend the day waiting passively for the next official knock. War had taught him the cost of passivity disguised as obedience. Instead, he started moving in quiet, practical ways, the same way he once prepared for operations no one else knew were going bad until too late. First, he went to the only people who had seen the truth of the bond up close and had no professional reason to lie about it, the hospital staff. The trauma nurse read the situation before he finished the first sentence. The old security guard heard the phrase canine evaluation and spat into the dust like the very idea tasted rotten. The tea seller said what all of them were thinking in her own sharper language. They ignored him when he waited in the rain, and now they want him because they finally understand his worth. The surgeon from the hospital, a man who distrusted sentimental argument but respected facts, agreed to sign a statement documenting the dog's role in the soldier's stabilization and recovery, including the direct observable effect on panic response, sleep regulation, and trauma episodes. The psychologist added another, not in grand emotional language, but in the precise formal style institutions feared because it was hard to dismiss. He wrote that forced separation at this stage of post-combat recovery would constitute a medically significant destabilizing event with foreseeable psychological harm. The veterinarian who had cleaned the old wounds and treated the parasite signed yet another statement, confirming that the animal was not feral, not unsafe, and had already formed a stable bonded pattern under the soldier's care. By midday, the soldier had a folder thicker than the original summons. He did not fool himself into thinking paper alone could defeat command. But paper created friction, and friction bought time. Time, as always, was where survival lived. The second move mattered even more. He spoke to the only surviving men from the skirmish, who had witnessed the battlefield part of the bond. One came on crutches. Another joined by phone from a rehab center farther north, with a voice still damaged by smoke inhalation. Their testimonies matched in all the ways that mattered. The dog had remained in the market ruins under live fire. The dog had redirected the wounded soldier away from the exposed lane. The dog had followed the evacuation truck across impossible distance. The dog had remained at the hospital entrance through weather and guards and hunger until the soldier emerged. None of them described a military asset. They described a living creature who had attached himself to one wounded man and altered his survival odds through instinct and loyalty alone. More important, one of them added a detail the soldier himself had nearly buried under everything else. Before the first shots, when the unit was still moving through the outer market line, the dog had repeatedly refused the eastern corridor and paced toward the western service break, the exact alley that later proved to be the only survivable line once the ambush closed. That mattered because if command tried to frame the dog as some discoverable battlefield tool, the surviving men could frame him first as something far less useful to bureaucracy and far more threatening to it, proof that living instinct had seen the danger earlier than official intelligence did. And institutions rarely liked being told that their systems had been outperformed by a starving stray. Still, none of that guaranteed safety. On the third afternoon, a military vehicle arrived outside the recovery block, and this time 2 men stepped out instead of one. One wore logistics insignia. The other wore the clean, deliberate expression of someone from the canine service branch. The soldiers saw them from the balcony before they ever knocked, and felt his body change in the old precise way it used to before an operation turned real. Breath lower. Pulse clearer. Vision narrower. Not panic. Readiness. By the time they entered, the folder of signed statements was already on the table, and the dog was sitting at the soldier's right side in complete stillness, watching. The canine officer did not waste time. He called the shepherd. Exceptional, high value, and worthy of structured assessment. He spoke about aptitude, olfactory discrimination under combat conditions, route reading instinct, and the possibility of rehabilitating the animal into formal service. Every sentence was clean, almost respectful, and entirely wrong. Because nowhere in that language was there room for what the dog had actually done. The soldier let him finish. Then he slid the hospital statements across the table one by one. Medical risk of forced separation. Confirmed bonded recovery pattern. Non-feral domestic adaptation under personal care. Witness testimony from battlefield survivors. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "He is not available for transfer," he said. The logistics officer glanced at the papers, then at the canine officer. The canine officer tried one more angle. "You understand this animal may possess operational value beyond private companionship." That was the sentence that finally made the soldier's expression harden in a way both men immediately recognized but probably could not name. "And you understand," he answered, "that he is alive because no one with operational authority cared whether he ate, slept, or bled at the hospital door until I walked out and claimed him." Silence took the room after that. The dog remained seated, not growling, not posturing, simply watching the men as if they were weather, and he was deciding whether it was worth moving. The officer from Canine Services looked at the animal, then back at the soldier, and whatever he saw there convinced him this would not be a neat acquisition. "There may be further review," he said finally. "Then review the reports," the soldier replied. "Not the dog." The standoff did not end with victory, only with delay. The men left carrying copies of the statements, and the district remained quiet for 2 days after that, which was worse than an immediate answer because silence let imagination do ugly work. The soldier slept lightly, waking at every engine sound outside. The dog sensed the vigilance and increased his own, spending more time near the door and balcony, scanning the courtyard below before settling. Yet inside that strain another truth kept growing. The life they were building was no longer temporary in his mind, no matter what the housing papers said. He found himself buying a better brush for the dog's coat from the market, buying tougher bowls, asking the widow down the hall where she got the good floor mats that didn't slide on tile, walking farther each morning despite the ache in his side, because the shepherd now expected the world beyond the gate to be part of their day. An expectation from a trusted creature was harder to disappoint than expectation from most people. One evening the dog fell asleep with his head on the soldier's boot while sunset burned copper across the balcony wall, and the soldier realized he had stopped thinking in discharge days and started thinking in weeks, in meals, in walks, in whether the dog's limp was less stiff after warm weather. That was when he understood the deepest truth beneath all the official pressure. The reason command's interest frightened him so badly was not only because they might take the dog. It was because taking the dog now would tear out the first real future he had allowed himself to imagine since before the skirmish. The answer came not from command, but from the battalion liaison late on the second night after the visit. The man arrived unannounced with dust on his boots and fatigue under his eyes, which meant he had fought for the information before bringing it. He closed the door behind him, looked at the dog asleep under the chair, and exhaled. "The review is split," he said. "Canine branch wants assessment. Medical and psych services are pushing back hard." Your surgeon apparently scared somebody important with the phrase foreseeable destabilization under military liability. The soldier almost smiled at that. Almost. And? The liaison sat down carefully and lowered his voice. And someone above all of them doesn't want more noise around the route failure than there already is. Taking the dog now creates noise. So unofficially, this is probably going to die if you keep your head down. The soldier leaned back and let that sink in. Not safety, not protection. Just the usual military compromise where truth survived only because another truth was more embarrassing. It should have infuriated him. Instead, for the first time in days, he felt his shoulders lower a fraction. The liaison glanced toward the animal. "You know he won, right?" "What?" "That dog. He waited at a hospital entrance until half a district fell in love with him, and the other half got too afraid of the story to touch him. He stood to go, then stopped at the door. You should probably leave temporary housing soon, before somebody changes their mind. That night the soldier stood on the balcony long after the city lights settled into their usual scattered glow. The dog stood beside him, shoulder touching his leg, both of them looking out over roads that no longer belonged to the hospital, the battlefield, or the review building. Somewhere beyond those roads there would be another place to live. Not luxurious, not even fully secure. Just theirs, if he was brave enough to claim it. He looked down at the shepherd and finally said the words he had been carrying all week, like a sealed order. We're done waiting for permission. The dog lifted his head, listening. Tomorrow, the soldier said, we find a place. The shepherd leaned against him with quiet certainty, and for the first time since the war reached back through official doors trying to take something from him again, the soldier felt not only resistance, but direction. The same direction the dog had offered in the desert, at the hospital entrance, and at every threshold since. Come with me. Keep moving. Choose life before somebody else decides what it's worth. What if the real ending of a war story was not the battle, not the hospital, not even the moment of survival itself, but the quiet day, when a wounded soldier finally understood that loyalty had followed him all the way back to life, and was still waiting to be chosen in return? He found that answer in a place so ordinary that most people passing by would never have noticed the weight of what it held. 3 weeks after the last call from the battalion liaison, after the quiet pressure from the review rooms had faded into safer silences, and the last of the official follow-up appointments had been reduced to dates on a card, the soldier moved out of temporary recovery housing and into a small rented place on the edge of the older part of the city, where the streets were narrower, the buildings lower, and life had a way of continuing without asking too many questions about where a man had come from. It was a simple house with sun-bleached walls, 2 rooms, a narrow kitchen, a bathroom with a stubborn rust line under the sink, and a small enclosed yard where dust gathered in the corners until the evening breeze pushed it into little spirals. There was a cracked step at the entrance, a low shade tree that looked half dead but kept trying, and enough space inside for 1 bed, 1 table, a chair by the window, and a blanket on the floor that no dog used because the dog preferred the strip of tile beside the front door where he could see both the yard and the room at once. To anyone else it might have looked temporary. To the soldier, who had learned how little a body actually needed to begin again, it looked like the first honest ground he had stood on in a very long time. The move itself had not been graceful. His side still tightened when he lifted too much weight, and the old deep ache through the torso reminded him every morning that healing was not a finish line, but a negotiation. The dog's hind leg remained stiff in the first minutes after sleep, especially on colder dawns, and there were nights when distant engine noise still made both of them lift their heads at the same second. But recovery had become less about avoiding what hurt and more about building enough life around the hurt that it no longer dictated every movement. They made routines out of almost nothing. Before sunrise, the soldier would open the front door and step into the narrow yard while the German shepherd checked the wall, the gate, and the street beyond with serious quiet attention before finally settling long enough to eat. After that came the walk. Not a march. Not training. Just the 2 of them moving through streets that gradually stopped feeling like someone else's world. At first the soldier chose the quietest lanes, the ones with little traffic and old stone walls that softened sound. Later, he expanded the route past a bakery that always smelled warm by dawn, then past a mechanic's yard where men lifting shutters in the morning learned to greet the dog before they greeted the soldier, then eventually to the small public garden near the old hospital road where dry grass still managed to grow around iron benches, and a cracked fountain that no longer held water. It was there, on one of those benches under weak winter sun, that he first realized he had gone half an hour without thinking about the skirmish. The thought came only after the fact, like noticing silence after long noise. He sat very still when he understood it. The dog, stretched at his feet in a stripe of light, opened one eye, confirmed the soldier was still there, and slept again. That ordinary trust hit deeper than any triumphant recovery speech ever could have. The world around them changed too, slowly enough that neither of them could fully resist it. The widow from the recovery block had sent along 2 small clay bowls as a parting gift for a proper home. The tea seller from the hospital came one afternoon in a taxi with a kettle, a bag of dried leaves, and more authority than anyone dared challenge, inspected the whole place as if assessing a forward post, and declared the yard acceptable only after the soldier promised to build shade for the hotter months. The older security guard visited once, awkward in civilian clothes, bringing a thick woven mat, and pretending he had found it cheap in the market, when the new stitching clearly showed it was made by hand. A nurse from the trauma ward stopped by on her day off carrying bandages, dog soap, and the kind of carefully contained emotion medical staff save for the rare patients who made it all the way back into something like a life. Even 2 of the surviving men from the unit came, one with a cane now instead of crutches, the other still carrying smoke in his voice, and sat in the yard drinking tea while the dog moved between them without fear, accepting from each man the shared knowledge that some bonds forged under fire belonged to everyone who had survived long enough to witness them. Not many words were needed. Men who had seen each other close to death rarely required much language to understand gratitude. One of them finally looked at the shepherd lying across the threshold and said, "He kept the promise for all of us." The soldier looked down at the animal and knew exactly what he meant, because that was the truth beneath everything. The dog had become more than a companion, more than a rescued stray, more than the miracle stories strangers at the hospital liked to repeat with softened voices. He had become continuity. The battlefield had taken men. The hospital had taken illusions. The review room had nearly taken trust in systems that were supposed to protect their own. But the dog had remained the one line unbroken from smoke to surgery to street. When memory dragged the soldier awake before dawn, the shepherd was there at the bedside before the fear had fully formed. When crowds became too loud, the pressure of the dog's body against his leg cut through noise more cleanly than any breathing exercise. When guilt returned with its old poisonous question, why him? Why still alive? Why when others did not walk out? There was always the shepherd's steady stare, as if the question itself were useless compared to more practical matters like food, movement, weather, and whether the front gate had been checked properly before sleep. Love did not arrive in his life now as softness. It arrived as presence. Weight against the shin. A living body in the doorway. A nose pushed under his hand when silence got too long. And for a man who had once believed he would spend the rest of his years as a witness only to loss, that kind of love was almost violent in its chillness. Then came the letter. Not from command. Not from a tribunal. Not from anyone asking him to explain the war again. It came from the hospital. A plain envelope, a familiar seal, and inside it a short note written by hand from the head trauma nurse. The emergency courtyard team was planting a small tree near the entrance as part of a memorial corner for staff and patients who had carried others through difficult recoveries. They would be honored if he attended. No pressure. No ceremony beyond simple gratitude. At the bottom, in handwriting different from the rest, the tea seller had added one extra line, "Bring the one who waited." The soldier read that sentence twice and sat with the paper in his lap while the dog slept beside the chair. Outside, the afternoon wind pushed dust softly across the yard. Somewhere a radio played old music from another street. He had not returned to the hospital since the final discharge review. Some places remained too full of versions of oneself too raw to meet casually. Yet when he looked down at the shepherd and imagined those entrance steps again, the answer had already formed. "We'll go," he said. One torn ear lifted. That was enough. The hospital looked smaller when they arrived. Not less important. Just smaller in the way once devastating landscapes sometimes did after enough living had happened elsewhere. The courtyard was busy, but not frantic that day. Nurses crossed between doors with files under their arms. A cleaner hosed down the outer path. The same security guard who once argued against the dog's presence straightened visibly at the gate when he saw them, then tried, and failed to hide the smile under his mustache. The tea seller, now stationed as always near the garden edge with her kettle and iron patience, lifted one hand like a commander acknowledging the return of a trusted unit. The head trauma nurse came down the steps and stopped in front of them for one long second before saying, in a voice that carried everything the note had not, "You both look better." The soldier glanced down. The dog's coat was strong now, thick and clean over muscle that had returned honestly, though the torn ear remained and the old limp still visited on cold mornings. He himself still carried scar tissue across the torso, still moved more carefully than before the war, still felt certain silences too sharply. But yes, they looked better. They had earned better. The memorial corner sat just to the side of the old emergency entrance, where the dog had once refused to leave. Someone had placed a bench there under the new tree, still thin but rooted, with a small plaque at its base. Not names of the dead. Not official titles. Just a simple inscription for those who waited, stayed, and carried life back through the dark. The soldier stood reading it while the dog sat beside him, gaze fixed not on the plaque, but on the same doors he had once watched day and night with starvation in his body and refusal in his bones. The soldier felt the old ache rise then, not a bad one, not panic, just the deep ache of seeing time folded back on itself. The entrance. The rain. The bowl of water. The first step out in a wheelchair. The first touch of rough fur against his hand after surgery. The impossible patience of a creature too loyal to obey despair. Without really thinking, he lowered himself carefully onto the bench. The dog looked up once, then climbed onto the concrete at his feet and rested his head on the same knee he had first claimed outside those doors. Around them, hospital life continued. Wheels rolled. Voices murmured. Someone laughed from the administration corridor. A stretcher crossed the far side of the yard. Nothing stopped for their memory, and somehow that made the moment truer. Healing had not required the world to freeze and admire it. Healing had happened while the world kept moving. The nurse sat beside him for a minute before her shift pulled her away again. "You know," she said softly, "for a while people thought the dog was waiting for you to come back out." The soldier kept one hand resting in the shepherd's fur. "He was." She shook her head. "No. I think now maybe he was waiting for you to choose to." Then she stood and left him with that. He stayed there a long time after. Long enough for the light to soften. Long enough for the courtyard shadows to lengthen. Long enough for memory to stop hurting like a blade and start hurting like weather. Still present, still real, but no longer the only force shaping the day. When he finally rose, he did not feel finished. Men like him were never finished in the simple way stories like to pretend. There would still be bad mornings. There would still be nights where the desert returned too vividly. There would still be names that hurt to remember and questions without satisfying answers about command failures, route lies, and why some men came home carrying lives others did not. But there was also this, a house with a dog at the door. Morning walks. A yard with bowls in the corner, and a patch of growing shade. People who knew some part of the truth. A body that, though changed, still moved. A heart that, though scarred, had not been abandoned after all. At the gate the dog paused and looked back once toward the emergency entrance. The same look. The same quiet question. The same invitation first offered in the dust of a shattered alley, and then again outside hospital doors. "Come with me." The soldier reached down, touched the collar lightly, and stepped into pace beside him. And that was the ending. Not that a stray dog waited at a hospital entrance until a soldier emerged. Not even that loyalty born in war survived long enough to become devotion. The real ending was this. A starving animal refused to let one wounded man vanish into silence. A wounded man finally accepted that being stayed for was not the same as being trapped. And together, step by step, they carried each other out of the fire, through the hospital doors, beyond the reach of official lies, and into a life neither of them had expected to be allowed. The world would always call the dog a stray, because the world noticed beginnings more than transformation. But the soldier knew better. That dog was never a stray again from the moment he chose to wait. And the soldier, in ways that mattered far more, was never truly lost again from the moment he chose to come back.